Well, thank you. Many thanks are due. Thank you, Carol, Christ. Also, I would very much like to thank the mother of Bethany, Corwin Palauska, who, along with several friends, established the fund that brought Terry to a wonderful resource for the university. And I also want to thank Stephen Barkley, without whom none of these events would happen, without being something perhaps on the line of a Keystone Cops routine. It's wonderful to have him helping us out. You know, as I look out at you all, in a certain sense, it strikes me as very strange, almost odd, that you would to hear someone whose claim to fame is that she asks questions, who has not even been anointed with the honorific of anchor person. But obviously, on the other hand, your being here is both reasonable and intelligent. After all, Fresh Air does, I think, provide us a kind of a refuge on what is otherwise a rather defoliated landscape. In thinking about what it is, why Fresh Air has such a place, I think, in most of our lives, you know, I couldn't say it any better than Terry Gross herself, and here's how she described what I think she's up to. And she said the simplicity is elegant. She said she wanted to provide a place where people can sound like themselves. A startling goal, it seems to me, in today's modern media. And Terry, I suppose we should just start with how did this idea evolve, and how do you come to be on our dial at all?
You mean like how did I start in radio, or how did Fresh Air start?
Yeah, and how did this idea that you have, that has grown into this program, that is such an institution, what was its evolution?
Well, I got hired, I started off doing a women's show in Buffalo. I went to college in Buffalo, and the university campus had a station that was an NPR affiliate that was a wonderful station that had a mix of, you know, blues shows and jazz shows and feminist shows and lesbian feminist shows and news shows and everything. And so I started there, and I got hired eventually to do Fresh Air, which was then a local show in Philadelphia that was 3 hours, 5 days a week. And boy, was that a lot of guests to book. Whew. And then slowly, we realized, we being me and Danny Miller, who has been the executive producer of the show for some time, we realized this is just too much. We have to fill so much airtime. We're putting people on the air who don't necessarily need to be on the air. So we figured, let's shrink the show. Instead of filling all this time, let's shrink the show and boil down a weekend edition, a kind of distilled version. And that distilled version ended up being a weekly NPR edition, and that weekly NPR edition ended up being a daily NPR edition, which is what we have now.
I wonder what the legacy of, you know, the very tumultuous 60s and 70s was on you and on the way that you do your program, treat your guests, and the things that you're interested in.
Well, a lot. First of all, I started in radio on a women's show, and that show wouldn't have existed without the women's movement and its renaissance in the late 60s and early 70s. And we had two goals on the show. One was good consciousness-raising programming, but the other was to train other women, because it was a period when there were very few women on the air, there were very few women in editorial positions, very few women in engineering positions. The women's movement was largely getting interpreted by men. But that's the other thing. When I was, you know, when I was a student and the anti-war movement was happening on the campus, we all felt it was getting misinterpreted by the mass media that was covering it. We felt they didn't understand the issues, that they didn't even do an accurate count of the people who were attending the demonstrations. So I think people were entering media then with this determination to kind of get it right, and to interpret a story that, stories that people outside the stories seemed somehow unable to comprehend. And you must have gone through something similar yourself. I mean, you started reporting during the Vietnam War. With the women's movement? No. But, I mean, you started reporting during the Vietnam War, and...
It was worse than that. I was at Berkeley.
Oh. So what were your impressions about what the media was getting right and wrong, and how did that affect who you wanted to be as a reporter?
Well, I mean, I think those years I mean, they were certainly seminal for me, which is why I asked the effect they had on you. I mean, both in my experiences in Asia, and I was out there for several years in Indochina, and then when I came back to Berkeley, it had all come home. There was a sense, I think, of something radically wrong. And of course, journalism at that time, I think for many people of my age, was very much of an advocacy profession, something which it took years to kind of balance out, to find the proper equilibrium between things we cared about and felt passionately about. And I guess growing older, too, then you have an ability to look back and to see where you were just completely out to lunch, and where the passion of the moment was actually quite deceptive.
Such as?
I think whenever you're in a situation that's confrontational, and indeed in Berkeley, I mean, right outside the doors here, I remember running across Sproul Plaza down the steps here as helicopters came over the campus spraying tear gas. And this was during the era of the anti-draft demonstrations. And it's very hard, I think, in those circumstances not to feel partisan. And certainly in Vietnam, I mean, I first went to Vietnam in the very early 60s. I mean, when Saigon was a lovely colonial capital, there were 1,000 American advisors. And at that point, I felt quite keen about the war and bought into the counterinsurgency notion that we should fight communists the way they fight, namely with guerrilla tactics. But it was in the later years that it became very evident to me that something horrendously wrong had started to happen. And again, I think it was very difficult, particularly for a younger journalist, to keep a kind of equanimity, and it was a lesson that had to be learned, how to allow readers to come to their own conclusions rather than to bully them into it.
I know for me, starting on a women's show, we had this sense that, you know, the old, now it sounds like a slogan, but the personal is political. And so we felt, you know, that we should be talking about things on the air that a lot of people weren't talking about then, because it was considered too icky, like menstruation or or childbirth. I mean, the mainstream press wasn't talking about that, and women's shows and the, you know, women's news, you know, columnists and so on all around the country were starting to do that in the late 60s and early 70s, and I think that's really been reflected in mainstream media since. Orville, I'm wondering, you know, after a career of reporting from really far-flung places, why you decided to accept the position of Dean of the Journalism School?
Well, you know, I think two things. It was a combination of, I mean, at first it seemed utterly implausible to me when I heard about this prospect. I started to think about other people. And then someone, I believe it was my wife, said, "What about you?" Well, it still seemed implausible. But as I began to think about it, two things occurred. One was the state of the media, which is what we're wrestling with here tonight. I couldn't find really any of the kinds of oases which I think to me, when I listen or read or watch television, that fresh air represents, that I wanted to be in. The few that I had, the New Yorker magazine had changed very much. And I thought, well, if that's the situation, maybe it's time to try to create some institutions. Everywhere I saw institutions in a state of kind of decay, at least in certain respects. So then I started to look more carefully, and I thought, well, aha, here is something that maybe we could take a positive attitude towards and build. So it was a combination of a great opportunity and also a sense, I think, of really discouragement by the possibilities that I saw around me. I mean, don't you feel somewhat besieged? Not in the sense that there are people trying to take you off the air, but don't you often feel like a rather an exception?
Well, I feel really lucky because I have incredible editorial freedom. I know it's a period in the press where a lot of editors are utterly uninterested in things outside of celebrity or in stories that is the story of the moment, whereas on our show, we could have on an obscure musician or a poet no one's ever heard of, and there isn't anybody saying, that's not going to get you ratings, you can't have that person on. And I think that that's a luxury that a lot of us in public radio feel, and I think, you know, it's certainly not like the big money that keeps people in public radio, but it's the editorial independence and the ability to speak in depth, to report in depth. It's a luxury. So,
it is a luxury, and yet, you know, in a certain elemental way, you and even us here at a public university, we are not immune to the vicissitudes of, if it isn't advertisers, it's trying to find the wherewithal to do what we want to do. And in your case, you have to get underwriters.
right.
And does that, I mean, I wonder, I mean, people I think might imagine that you don't feel any pressure or don't feel that that's something you have to worry about, but do you?
I try not to worry about it a lot because it sounds like the AA prayer or something, but I try to worry mostly about the things that I have some control over. And I don't have any control over that, and it's not my job to go out and get money. In fact, I try to keep as far away from that as possible because I like to just think about who's on the show more than thinking about who's going to pay for the show. So, like when I lay awake worrying at night, I'm more likely to be worrying about who the next day's guest is or what I'm going to ask them. And my feeling about money is that the best thing I could do is to do a good show, because that's the only thing I have control over. And I say to myself, well, hopefully if the show is good, someone will want to fund it. But on the larger level, I'm always worrying about the state of public radio in general, the state of our program in particular. Will there be funders? How will the constant crisis of funding affect the form and content of public radio in general? What pressures will we be up against that we might feel we have to succumb to?
What would you do, Terry, if, in fact, your program hit a bad patch and they just said, gee, sorry, you're not our kind of broadcaster?
And I'm prepared for that to happen. I don't know how I'm prepared, but no, I would. I have no idea what I would do. I have absolutely no idea what I would do.
That's good preparation.
but I'm not worried about it in the sense that I figure, well, it'll be an adventure. You know, I mean, I don't want to be ruled by paranoia, and maybe, you know, I've been doing this a long time. Hopefully, I'd be able to keep interviewing someplace or do something, but I've just never been able to see into the future, either in terms of institutions or myself. Now, you've worked in several different kinds of... but enough about me. You've worked in several different kinds of media institutions and kind of on opposite ends. You know, you spent many years writing for The New Yorker, you've written for The Atlantic, which are the most reflective outlets in the magazine world. You've also been writing for Newsweek, which is a weekly, a fine magazine, but it's much more compressed, it's much more in the moment as opposed to standing back and reflecting, you know, on a larger issue. What's the difference in like what the editorial process is like at both of those places?
Well, you know, it's interesting that I was doing a whole series for Newsweek this summer on the handover of Hong Kong, and it was right around that time that I was told, and I believe this to be true because galleys would come back stamped, not fact-checked, that fact-checkers vanished. Now, this was a very disconcerting moment because there you are out, you could be anywhere in the world, and you really don't have the resources to kind of check on things like that. Well, it's very much higher speed, things are much shorter, but you know, there's a place for that kind of writing. And I don't lament it, and I don't think all writing, all broadcasting ought to be of one kind. But, you know, there's also a place for longer, more thoughtful, reflective pieces that don't get done quickly.
Do you have to sell an idea to Newsweek and work hard to make them think that this is important enough?
You know, it's interesting. If you're trying to, I think, not always true, but often true, if you're trying to sell an idea to anybody, they probably don't want it.
Right.
I mean, the way publishing seems to work today is you have to, and Hollywood certainly, you have to get them to think they have the idea and come to you. But there's a danger in that, because the idea will be in some other person's fevered brain, and it will be going off and have a life of its own. And then you will write something and it may not comport with that idea. So I think, I mean, elementally, the process really should begin with the person. I mean, you decide who you want on your program, who interests you. People aren't saying, oh, you got to have on this starlet or this, you know.
Well, the publicist is saying that.
and you're saying, well, you know, I don't know. And you still don't have to have people on you don't want.
Right.
But that, it seems to me, is very rare now. I mean, you do exist in that respect in a very privileged and fortunate circumstance.
Yeah, and we actually make guests. Guests have to go through a lot to get on the show in a way. We have to be convinced that their movie is good, or their performance is good, or the book is interesting, or we love their new record, and then maybe we're not sure, well, can they speak well? And one of the producers will often pre-interview the guest just to find out, are they good on the radio? Because, I mean, the truth is, like, when you're on the radio, all you have, your only tool, is the ability to speak in an interesting or compassionate or revealing way. And some people have a gift for acting or a gift for playing music, but they don't have that verbal gift. So what we really look for is the ability to communicate on the air, to be reflective. I mean, we think of our show as a place where people can reflect on their work, on an issue. I mean, Orville, for example, has been a guest many times on the show, and he just has a knack for whatever is happening in China or Tibet that we want him to talk about. He has a knack for finding the right words in a concise but filled with depth kind of way that, is really gripping to listen to. And, it's not hard to find that. You have to shop for that. You have to call up a lot of experts to find the one who can actually do that.
It's interesting, Terry, because the feeling that I have very often when I'm on some interview, A, no one's read anything, B, they don't know who you are, C, they don't care about the issue, but never mind. You come away from it feeling somehow as if you wish you hadn't done it. You feel somehow as if there'd been a kind of a tawdry transaction, that there wasn't time to give the nuance of what it was that you really wanted to say. Whereas I think with Fresh Air, and certainly it was true in the old New Yorker, I mean, I always felt when I finished a piece, well, that's it. There's nothing more I can do to this. The editors, the writer, the whoever it is. And that's a wonderful feeling, again, a very privileged feeling, but I think one that increasingly we journalists are missing.
I want to find out just a little bit more about, say, the New Yorker versus Newsweek in editing. Is your work like house organed, so to speak, at a place like Newsweek where a writer comes in and puts it into a house style? What's the difference in the way editors work with you in two places which are stylistically as different as they are?
Well, I've been lucky at Newsweek because I was doing things which were more sort of essayistic. And, if you look in news magazines in Time or Newsweek or U.S. News and World Report, at the bottom you often see 4 or 5 names. Yeah. And, writing basically is not a collaborative process, except insofar as a writer and an editor work. And, these things have been really written by no one. It isn't very rewarding. It is, you're just sort of like some sous chef that's, chopping up the celery and passing it on down the line. But again, I mean, I think there's even a place for that kind of, I mean, there is fast-moving events, there are newspapers, and there's some very good writing, and, often people in New York will put stuff in an article from Africa. But again, I think it's a question of keeping the full range of possibilities in all kinds of broadcast and documentary film and writing. And I think that's what we lament, or I lament. And certainly, I don't know what you think, but when you look at what's on the AM radio dial, what's your assay of our state of excellence?
AM radio?
Yeah.
Well, AM radio, it's just this interesting conglomeration of things now, you know, from all news radio to oldies stations and talk shows. It's actually pretty interesting in its own way. I mean, not for like heavy intellectual content, but it's an interesting patchwork of stuff. And the cool thing about AM radio is that, you know, on a clear night you could drag in signals from distant places, which it's been a long time since I've done that. But I mean, radio has become just very highly formatted in a lot of ways. I guess you all know that already, but... I
mean, you may drag in this station from far away and you'll be hearing the same thing you're hearing on your local station.
Oh, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. And NPR is getting more nationalized in a way. I've been more and more, all of our stations are carrying more and more national shows. And some people are a little worried that some of the local flavor will be lost, because there's so many national shows like Fresh Air now taking up the time, you know, on the formats. So it's something that's debated a lot within public radio.
You know, Terry, you've noted that, I mean, one of the things that you try to do is to be a kind of a cultural scout who brings in people from the margins into the center. Describe that process a little.
Well, the process is kind of a basic one. You know, just reading a lot, going to a lot of movies, watching television, listening to records, reading things like Publishers Weekly and some of the music magazines, just always having up antenna, reading magazines and newspapers, and reading your mail, answering the phone. I mean, the truth is, everybody in the entertainment world has people out there representing them now. They have agents, they have publicists, they have managers. And there's this constant like two-way communication at our offices. The phones are always ringing. There's always people calling, you know, publicists calling and so on, representing people who want to get on the show. And then we're always phoning out to those people and to other people who don't have people calling us, who we want to have on the show. And what's overwhelming for us is that because we're public radio and because our budget is so modest, we're actually really understaffed. And even if you hear a long list of names at the end of the show, a lot of those names are people who work with us freelance or part-time, and we're never all there at the same time. You know, maybe one of those people is there for 3 hours one day and the other's there for 6 hours the next. So it's really hard to do what we truly want to do, which is know everything. You know, and we always feel so frustrated sitting in our little offices without windows in Philadelphia, feeling like, okay, and we're cultural scouts. You know, so our windows on the world are, you know, books and radio and television and movies and so on. But on the other hand, that's where a lot of the culture is, and especially if you're covering the arts, that's where it is. You know, it's on the airwaves, it's on the CDs, it's in the movie theaters, and besides, that's the place I've always liked to be, is by the turntable and in the movie theater, so I can't complain.
You know, Terry's been out here all week and teaching in classes and one thing or another, and one of the sentiments that you expressed is that you find that you're much more gentle with cultural figures, and you actually say to people on air, if you don't feel you said it clearly, have another go at it. We want you to have a chance to say it the way you want to. But on the other hand, with politicians, you don't cut them that slack.
I have different rules. I think that there's, and I think there's nothing wrong with it. I think there's many different kinds of interviews that I end up doing. One is the informational interview. Tell us what's happening, what you saw, and please explain that part of the world to us. Another is the personal interview. You know, you tell us about your family life and so on. And then there's, you know, the analytical art interview. You make this kind of movie, tell us about the craft of making it. And every type of interview demands a different type of question and a different type of approach. when I'm interviewing somebody in the private world, someone who's not elected into office, I think that they should have the right to draw the line between what's public and what's private. I feel, you know, that private citizens don't owe us telling us about their dysfunctional family or their former cocaine habit or something. It's really none of our business. They don't owe us telling us about their sex life or their sexual orientation. On the other hand, many artists use their own life as a kind of case study to examine, you know, what it's like to be human. And it's usually those people who I will really talk very personally about very personal things: health, religion, sexual orientation, sexuality. But these are people who feel like it is that they're just introspecting. They're using like the microcosm to get to the macrocosm, using their story to get to our story.
And this is not politicians.
This is not politicians. Politicians, I feel, are already very good at manipulating the press, and I don't want to give them any more tools than they already have to manipulate me. So I'll never say to them, hey, you draw the line between what you want to tell me and what you don't. And I'll never say, if you don't feel like you got it right the first time around, if you realize what it is you really wanted to say after you started saying it, please take a breath and start it over again. With with citizens, you know, with unelected officials, I feel like my goal is to create clarity, and anything I can do to help them express a clearer thought, I want to help them do. But I don't want to help a politician kind of revise the truth. I'm afraid they're going to take advantage of me. What do you think of that, Orville? I consider you to be the kind of... no, seriously, I'm afraid, like, as the dean of journalism school, you're going to tell me this is a terrible thing. I'd really like to know, because these are rules, I never went to journalism school, and this is stuff I just kind of made up for myself as I went along. And it's something I'm kind of, you know, happy to tell people who don't work in radio, but I'm always afraid that if other journalists find out about this, that they'll mock me, and they'll say, you can't do this. This violates, like, we have a religion, and you violated it. And in fact, you're going to be excommunicated now. And so I'm afraid to hear it, but what do you think? Is there anything wrong with this?
Well, I don't know. I'm not a big kind of gotcha journalist myself. I mean, but then I don't have the pressures of sort of getting the daily story, and I'm not primarily an investigative reporter. I mean, I think there is a way to treat people very respectfully, and to really pull them out that way. It takes more time. You have to hang around. I did a book a long time ago on Governor Jerry Brown, and my strategy, I didn't know what else to do, so it wasn't a very brilliant strategy, was just to go and sit in the waiting room in the governor's office. And I did that for months. And, you know, I had no interview, I had no access, and gradually they began to notice me, and then when he'd leave for a speech, I'd be trotting behind him. Well, I mean, I learned a lot, rather than trying to go right in and get the big interview and find some inconsistencies. I think there's a real place for that. It just isn't my style. I don't really feel comfortable with it. But I don't think that other people shouldn't get out there and be hard-nosed. But that makes me think of a question I wanted to ask you, Terry. Do you think it's possible to be civil, decorous, and still be hard-hitting?
Yeah, I do. And I know some people feel that you have to kind of strut around and theatrically portray the big, tough prosecutor to ask a hard question, and I don't think you need to. I think you can ask it. I think you can ask a tough question in a respectful voice, and I think that you don't have to be a show-off to, you know, expect the truth of someone and to insist on the truth. Not necessarily, I mean, you won't necessarily get it by insisting on it, but yeah, I think you can be respectful and kind of quiet and still be dogged and insistent and determined.
You know, in the kind of interviews you do, of course, you can use silence to your advantage, because if you don't say anything, they're going to have to fill the space. But of course, if you're at a White House press conference, you know, Sam Donaldson will jump up, and there will be no silence.
Right.
So you'll just seem lame and ineffectual. So I think that the speed of everything mitigates against, you know, letting people think a bit, feel awkward with the time that's passing and nothing's getting said, and that's sometimes when the most telling things come out.
I feel like we've spent our careers in completely opposite ways in a way, because you've been to China, you've been to Tibet, to Vietnam, you've been in the middle of revolution, you've been in the middle of counter-revolution. I have spent my career in a small, dim room. And in fact, I don't usually even see the people I'm interviewing because they're at a remote location. So I'm alone in that small, dim room. And I rely on what people tell me as being true, and it sometimes isn't. And I often won't even know one way or another whether it is or it isn't. But I'm wondering, I'd like to ask you a little bit about being in China in the early period when you were covering it. There was a period in the United States, particularly among the counterculture, when Mao was a real hero. He was like a cultural icon. And the Chinese Revolution was considered a kind of utopian revolution for quite a while, I think in the 60s and in the early 70s. And I think a lot of student radicals in the United States really looked to China to kind of help them lead the way. And I'm wondering if you ever, as a journalist, looked also to China in a utopian way, and if there was a point for you where, if so, if there was then a point for you where you started to become much more skeptical or even cynical about what you saw happening.
It's an interesting question. I mean, in many ways, as you know, I'm now writing a book about Tibet, which is a kind of a dream, a kind of a fantasy in many respects over the last 100 years or so. I mean, what the West has made of it. In certain respects, I think during the early Maoist years, it was also a sort of a fantasy for Chinese too. It was a dream of a new deliverance, a new identity, and I think for people, as many students in the 60s who were dissatisfied with society they found here and the kind of governance that they confronted, it was a temptation to do exactly what we do now vis-a-vis Tibet, is to project, and to project our yearnings, our hopes. And I think, I had gotten interested in China quite apart from all of this, but there was a period where I was fascinated to see if it could be done another way. I mean, if a country could be run, if life could be run, if another system could work. And there are various shades of that on the political spectrum. But that was the hallmark of the period. People were casting around. Right now, we have a kind of a triumph of the marketplace and of democracy, and nobody thinks about sort of the dimensionality of possibilities. So I think that was a strong enticement. And then, of course, for me, the fact I couldn't go to China till 1975 because it was closed, it was really the ultimate kind of seduction.
Your first time was in 75. For some reason, I thought you were there earlier.
No, remember, Nixon only went in 72.
True.
And that was the beginning of the reopening.
Right. So when you got there, were you more cynical than you expected to be about what you saw?
I was very confused. I spoke Chinese. I thought I understood how things ought to work, and yet I found this incredible coldness, aloofness, and I really didn't know how to explain it. At first, I thought maybe it's something wrong with me. Maybe because I was a writer. I had all sorts of explanations. The truth was, people were scared to death. That foreigners were the source of contagion, and writers were the vectors of this contagion, and they were tantamount to being, agents. So, I mean, but it took a while to understand that, and then finally, when things warmed up and you could begin to really talk to people openly, there was no personal world that you could interface with Chinese in the early years.
The responsibility you have, I think, when you're writing about a country in which there's very little freedom, and people are risking their lives to talk with you, is how are you going to quote them without risking their lives? Have there ever been any terrible consequences of something that you wrote?
Well, one has to be very careful. Very often, though, the people that I would write about, if I named them, were people who were quite fearless and quite amazing, and there weren't a lot of them. And those people had kind of taken into account the consequences, and that's relatively easy. It's much harder when, their parents and their wives and their children and And I think certain kinds of authoritarian societies really do hold these peripheral people hostage, and it is a way of keeping people generally silenced. Well, it must be, odd for you to sit in your little black booth, and the world is sort of pouring into you. Do you ever yearn to get out and about more?
It's funny. I was thinking the last few days I've been in residence at the School of Journalism, and I've been so lost just trying to find my way on campus. I kind of stop every time there's one of those maps on the campus. I look at it and figure out, now where am I? So I think it's lucky that I've been in that room, because I'd get so lost. I think I'm such a kind of, in my own way, like introverted type of person that that little room is in some ways where I belong. And I felt very lucky to be able to kind of work the territory of the world of ideas and the inner life. One of the things I really try to do when I talk to someone is to explore their inner life, their imagination, the sensibility of the person. And you don't need to go far away or to be on the scene per se to explore that. And it's something that I've always been just kind of immensely interested in people, and it seems very suited to my own sensibility to do that. And I also love the opportunity to debrief people like you, Orville, when you come back from this big adventure reporting abroad. So tell us what it was like. I'm not a physically brave person. I'm not an adventurous. I think I'm intellectually adventurous, but physically a coward. And so I don't think I would have made a very good foreign correspondent. I don't think I would have dreamed of doing something like that. I also like to be comfortable. I don't mean, with all, the fine food and all that, but just, to have a comfortable chair, a decent bed, my own bathroom. So it wouldn't have been that far-flung life would not have worked for me. I don't think I would have been good at it. I don't think I would have enjoyed it.
I should tell the audience that one of the things that Terry always does is to say, if you don't feel comfortable answering something, just tell me. We'll push to the point and then we'll stop. Now, I say that in preface. I want to ask you, because you are such a hard worker, and you're married, but your husband has a life similar to yours, and your work is such a huge part of your life. What else makes life meaningful for you?
Right. Well, okay, the interesting thing is the things that I'm most passionate about tend to be the things I also talk about on the show. So in that sense, I'm really lucky because my passions and my work are so intertwined. I mean, I love music. I love jazz. I particularly love jazz singing. So what do I do on the show? I have a lot of musicians, a lot of jazz singers. I love movies. There you go. I love literature. Lots of authors on the show. I love thinking about things and talking to people who think about things. The downside is there's so much preparation you have to do to find the right guests, and then to prepare for the guests, to know enough about the guests so that they'll trust you with their story, that there's very little room for outside life. And I marvel, particularly like when I come to the West Coast, like to San Francisco, people really seem to know how to live here. I mean that. You're surrounded by such natural beauty, and everybody seems to know how to enjoy that natural beauty. And people seem to know how to take time out for a glass of wine and fine food. And I often have not had.
Spoiled you.
I often have not had that balance in my life. And I think when I found radio, I wanted it so bad. And I thought, I will do anything to stay here and to keep this. And what I did was just work really, really hard. And then, you build a show for yourself, and to keep the show good, you have to constantly work hard. And it's meant giving up a lot of, personal life. But
do you have any regrets about things that you may have missed?
And I'd like to work less, but I feel like my life has been so far very rich because I've had the chance to speak with such interesting people, and even if I don't meet them face to face, I get to engage them in the discussion of ideas, which is a wonderful thing. I enjoy my work a lot, even though there's too much of it. But I know I've shut out a lot, and I guess I have some regrets about that. But not, I don't feel like I would rewrite my life if I have the chance. If this isn't too personal for you, I know you have young children now. And I'm wondering if you feel like you've been reevaluating your two things are happening simultaneously.
At least.
Yeah, right. But I mean, you have this new position, which is really important and really big, and the other people's lives are your responsibility now, the students and the professors, because you're the dean of the school. At the same time, you have the responsibilities to your children. So do you feel like you are in a position now where you have to like reevaluate your priorities? And again, if it's too personal.
Well, I mean, I think people are always struggling with this balance, particularly, people in the media have to travel. I mean, you don't, but you have a different kind of travel that this all-consuming. I mean, I wouldn't trade my children in for anything. I have a wonderful wife, and actually we have an extended family of grandparents living with us, which really takes the heat off. And it means that one can afford to be somewhat more remiss and still feel the children are in good hands. And also as a writer, I mean, I can't spend as much time writing as I used to, but when I do write, I'm home. And the kids come running out to the office, and they bang on the computer for a while and grind up a few pencils, and then they're off. So at least from that perspective, one can kind of do both things at once. But I mean, it's a constant struggle I think we all have. And I think one of the problems is that the whole information revolution, which has facilitated us knowing more, and we've got email and the internet and blah, 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 blah. And instead of making our life easier, as wearing blenders and washing machines once were promised to do, it's given us more possibilities. Now, surely, you must feel that in spades.
Absolutely. When people say, isn't it great we're now connected on the internet, I think, yeah, it's the good news and it's the bad news. I mean, what do I want in my life? More information? Not really. I mean, on the other hand, I mean, the internet's wonderful. And the other day I needed to call the Museum of Modern Art for information. The Chuck Close interview was on the air. His show is at the Museum of Modern Art, and I realized, oh my God, I don't know what day the show is closing. And the tape is running, and I had to find out. So I was going through voicemail hell through the Museum of Modern Art. I got the answer quicker on the internet because I was doing both at the same time. And so the internet's great. But on the other hand, there's so much that we're expected to keep up with, and it's a headache. It's literally a headache. I mean, I think we're all taking more aspirin than we need to, because there's so much to keep up with. You know what I'd like to, we are, we not only have had such opposite careers in the sense that I'm in the small dim room and you're all over the world, but we've been on opposite ends of the book tour.
Yeah.
You've been the interviewee, I've been the interviewer, and I'd love it if we could kind of compare notes about experiences on both ends of that. I know particularly a few years ago, a lot of the people who I was interviewing seemed to have been coached. I mean, I know in fact many of them were literally coached. A lot of the publishing companies would hire freelance coaches if they felt that their interviewee required this, and the coach would tell them how many times per interview to mention the name of their book, how to figure out what the 5 major points were they wanted to hit, and how to hit those points no matter what you're asked. And this was like the bane of my existence. I could ask anything and I'd get this answer that was, on the list of being one of those 5 points. Did you ever get suggestions from a publicist or from an official coach of what you're supposed to say when you're on a tour promoting a book?
In a certain sense, I think it's even worse than that, because they asked me to write the questions that I should be asked. and then asked me to write the answers to send out to the, to the interviewers. So in a certain sense, it was an utterly meaningless experience. I mean, they didn't need the anchor person at all. I could have auto-interviewed.
Well, so you probably knew your part, because I bet you ran into people who asked exactly those questions when they were interviewing you, yes?
I mean, it's mind-numbing. And, what's really sad about it is that after a while, you lose the ability to think anything new, except the answer to the questions you wrote and you know they'll ask. And you hear yourself just going again and again and again, like some sort of tape loop. And you just yearn for someone to kind of kick you out of the rut. But alas, there's so few places. When I'm on Fresh Air, I mean, I'm sitting in the dark room. You're sitting in the dark room. I'm looking at a wall. I don't know what you're looking at. And it's like sort of falling into some sort of a sleep. And it really, I wonder, in a way, in a certain sense, you are kind of like a psychoanalyst. You don't see, you're not looking at the patient isn't looking at you. And actually, that's supposed to be a very good environment in which to get people to speak openly. And I think it actually happens. And it's part of what makes it so exciting, is that you don't have to deal with the person, with the celebrity, how they're dressed, does my hair stick up? I mean, I had my hair sprayed tonight because we're on television, so I wouldn't have a horn. But we don't have to do that in radio.
No, and on the few times I've done television, it's been like prom night. Like, oh my God, if I have a pimple. I mean, a pimple is like a career liability. If you're doing television, a bad hair day, it can ruin your career. I could probably be naked and the person I'm interviewing wouldn't know the difference. It doesn't matter. And that's I love the invisibility of radio. I mean, it's so...
It used to be that people were invisible. They did, ballet dancers didn't talk, radio hosts didn't write, editors just edited, writers wrote, singers sang. Now everybody's supposed to sort of have something to say about what they do.
Well, do you feel now that for writers such as yourself and other writers that that your ability, like the size of your book contract, the amount of money even that you're getting paid, and not to mention whether you're even going to be signed in the first place, is going to be commensurate with your ability to get on talk shows or into feature stories in magazines and actually sell the book?
Well, it certainly influences what the public relations departments are willing to throw behind it. Mm-hmm. And I have a feeling, the question I wanted to ask you really relates to this. Mm-hmm. And the question is, why do you think the media has become so disesteemed? I mean, maybe it has something to do with the fact that it's just this charade. I mean, the people on magazine shows, they're not real reporters. They're actors. And a producer is writing the script. And they're very good at what they do. But, the real problem, in my experience in doing television, is getting that anchor person into the story. It's a real pain in the neck.
What do you mean?
Well, they have to be on site. They have to be standing there with the epaulettes and the Banana Republic jacket. So it looks like they are the reporter, but basically they're not the reporter. But anyway, back to my question.
About why the media is disesteemed. Well, I think people feel every which way about the media now because there's so much that is the media. The media is both C-SPAN and the evening news it's C-SPAN and it's the guy in the epaulettes and
the internet.
And it's the internet, and it's it's NPR, and it's the kind of two-way talk show where it's all about just getting people angry so that they'll call up and insult each other and start off this, controversy. I mean, it's everything. And so I think people feel everything about the media. My experience is that there's parts of the media that people are passionately in love with and other parts that they passionately hate. And then a whole span of things that they know nothing of because there's so much media now, but it's impossible to know everything that's out there. Even on cable, how can you possibly know everything that's there? And media is so segmented and specialized now. So my experience is that people feel every which way.
But on the Richter scale of excellence, how would you plot the graph?
Every which way. I mean, I think there's some extraordinary programs and journalists and interview shows and some really crap. And, you know, you figure out where the good stuff is that is suited to what you want and where the other stuff is, and you use your time accordingly. That's my reading.
Do you think it's possible that we may reach a time where there is sort of such pluralism, I mean, particularly with cable television and the internet, that there really is no longer anything much we share in common? I mean, now we may have the New York Times if you're of a certain sort of person, but then when we get together, what do we talk about? We didn't hear the same program, read the same thing. We're not on the same, reading out of the same hymnal.
Well, I think that's really interesting. I mean, when I was growing up, there were basically like the three TV networks and a couple of smaller stations, and everybody watched the same shows, and there were a few newspapers, and everybody read the same thing. And yes, you know, it's hard to find out outside of, say, Seinfeld, people who watch the same entertainment TV shows now. And I think that that's, just speaking for the little world I'm in, that's something that holds a lot of NPR listeners together, is this feeling that, you know, we listen to the same program. I heard and you heard All Things Considered last night, and we could talk about the same report that we heard. And I think in some ways that NPR has very little competition on the radio band, which isn't to say there aren't a lot of other good things to listen to, but there aren't many other shows that behave in a way similar to, there aren't a lot of like long-form news magazines on the radio outside of the ones on NPR. There isn't something comparable to Prairie Home Companion on the radio outside of NPR, and so on. So I think it's an ironic period for NPR in that there's this fragmentation, a lot of competition, but no one else on radio is doing the same kind of programming, and I think it holds us as listeners and as an audience together. I mean, one of the greatest compliments I can get is when people say, you know, my daughter and I, or my mother and I, talked about something we heard last night over dinner, or long distance, you know, and I don't know.
What do you enjoy watching on television, or what do you really, I mean, what really is satisfying to you?
Well, I don't get nearly enough time to watch TV as I'd like. And I should
report to you all that Terry moved into the very sumptuous women's faculty club where they eschew television, but actually did manage to find one that was rolled into her room.
In fact, this is a Northern California story, but a few years ago I was looking for like an inn or something to stay in Northern California, and I was auditioning them by saying, and do you have television in the room? So I didn't want to stay in a place that didn't have a TV. And so people were just like, a television in the room. And then one of the people said to me, a television in the room. She said, well, why don't you try conversation? I'll spare you the expletive I was thinking in response to that.
Like asking for a Pepsi at Chez Panisse.
Yeah. But when I do get to watch TV, I'm one of those like remote control people. My idea of like a program is just kind of clicking and clicking and clicking. So I always like check to see, okay, what's C-SPAN, what's CNN up to? You know, I'll try to watch like Ellen and Seinfeld. Ellen isn't even on anymore. I often watch like telethons and infomercials, religious programming. There's this really kind of strange religious dance show on, it's like a Christian teen dance party show on one of the cable stations. My husband's deep into this show. It's like when the show's on, he doesn't leave the house, you know. But I think television, especially now with all these local cable shows, there's like really remarkably odd shows going on. When I grew up, there was something called $1 Million Movie. One of the like local stations, New Yorkers, yeah. It was this, and because there was so little programming that the station could get, it would show like RKO movies and Warner Brother movies. There would be one movie a week, and it would show it over and over again, like continuous showings all night on weekday nights, and then continuous showings of this one movie all weekend afternoon and into the night. So, you know, I had like every line from King Kong and Mighty Joe Young memorized, Hunchback of Notre Dame memorized. And now cable's like that because things are just broadcast over and over. So I think TV's in this like fascinating period because it's like the early days when there isn't enough programming to go around, and there's all these odd shows and repetitions of shows. So, you know, I love watching that oddball, weird stuff.
You know, I see time's winged chariot is moving along. Maybe we should do some questions. Is there anything we haven't talked about? Did we talk about celebrities enough, do you think? No. I mean, clearly, we are living in an era, if you aren't someone, it's hard to get noticed on the media. How do you deal with this question of celebrities?
Well, I interview people who have never been on the radio before, and I interview people who are celebrities. I'm finding it's a very difficult time to interview celebrities because in the world of personality journalism, news is equated with finding out something very embarrassing about the celebrity. And it's kind of like the equivalent of the gotcha moment in the politician interview. So celebrities often come to interviews with all their defenses up. And what I like to do in an interview is make connections between the life someone's chosen to lead, the way they were brought up, and the sensibility that they develop that led to the kind of acting they do or the kind of music that they make. And I might ask a really kind of, to my mind, harmless, innocent question about something in their background, and they will act as if I said, "Tell me who you were in bed with last night. It wasn't your wife, was it?" As if I have this like horrible agenda that I'm getting to. And I empathize, I understand why they feel that way, but it's really not what I'm trying to do. And it makes it really hard for me to do an interesting interview. Consequently, I've been finding, you know, some celebrities have actually walked out on me for interviews that have seemed to me to be, you know, really pretty harmless. So it's a kind of baffling period for me in that respect. I've come to find it very difficult to interview people who are very famous, also because they're sick and tired of telling their stories. I was interviewing Steve Martin not long ago, and I wanted to, among other things, talk to him about his early career as a stand-up comic, some of his early movies. And at some point, we were recording the interview, at some point he said to me, in the nicest way and in the most respectful way, he said to me, "I beg you, don't make me tell these stories again. I can't do it anymore." And I completely empathized. But of course, you know, as the interviewer, I wanted him to tell some of those stories. I hadn't heard those stories. I wanted him to tell it on our show. And so I think one of the problems, and this gets back to the book tour thing, is that people get tired of telling the story of their life. And you find, I think, when you've been interviewed a lot, that your life becomes reduced to these polished anecdotes.
Well, it is sales.
Excuse me?
It's sales.
Well, I think it's more than sales. I think it's that, you know, you've only lived one life, and you've only had one set of experiences. And no matter how honest you're trying to be, these are the only experiences you've had, and if you've been asked to tell them a lot of times, what are you going to do? Make up other ones? Lie? I mean, so you find yourself, you know, you are forced to tell the same stories over again, and it can become very problematic for even the people with the best of intentions.
But it raises the question of why do it?
Right.
Why is it being done?
Right.
And I think often it is because you feel, well, there's a movie or a book or something that has to be sold.
When I was someone like me, I want Steve Martin on the show. He might be tired of the story of his life. I'm not. I like this guy. I admire him. He's talented. He's funny. He's a good actor. I want to spend time in his company. I'd like for him to be as real as possible. But, you know, Nicolas Cage, I don't care. If he's tired of being interviewed, I don't care. I want to have him on the show. I want to spend time in his company. And so it's a real dilemma.
And yet, Terry, you told me that when you go around, as you periodically do, giving talks, you're trying to think, oh yes, Boston, did I tell this story in Boston yet?
Right. You know, because I've been interviewed a fair amount now, and I live in fear of becoming my worst nightmare of an interviewee. You know, it's like, oh, that story again. Oh God, I heard that one, you know, 2 years ago. But I've had a very kind of narrow life because I'm mostly in that dim room, you know, and I'm not going out and, you know, every week I'm in a different country, you know, having these different adventures. I live a very insular life, and I don't even go out, I don't even socialize a lot. I mean, I'm mostly home. I'm mostly home reading books or going to those movies or talking to my husband. I don't even have a lot of friends. I don't. I have a lot of acquaintances, but I don't have a lot of friends. I'm a horrible friend. I am, you know. It's the paradox of my life is that while I'm home preparing to be the sensitive interviewer, I'm the lousy friend. Because if I'm preparing for tomorrow's interview with Orville and my friend calls me, I'm going to have to hang up on them in a couple of minutes so I can prepare for the interview.
You know, you had something, I have it down here someplace, taped to a phone that I read that a Louis Pasteur quote, I don't know if you still have this on your phone, chance favors the prepared mind. Is this apocryphal or true? I got this on the internet.
Was it on our website?
You know, I can't remember.
So I don't do the website. I mean, I don't form the website. So
No, it wasn't on your website. I think it was in some article. That,
about me?
yeah.
Oh, well, it's an unfamiliar
There you
quote
go.
to me.
You can incorporate that in your...
But I agree with it. I agree with... No, I do. I mean, because I mean, like, my approach is to be as prepared as I can, you know, in the amount of time that I have, but on the other hand, not to be a slave of the preparation. But, you know, I wouldn't dream of doing an interview, if I could avoid it, that I hadn't prepared for, that I hadn't had some structure for. But those aren't... That isn't a quote I've lived by, because
I want the audience to know that all of the questions in your lap were written by me with answers given to Terry. Let's do some questions ourselves. Let me ask you one, Terry. Why does the average American know who Kitty Kelly is and not Pol Pot?
Is that true? I mean, I wouldn't accept that that's true. There's a lot of things that we believe to be true that I don't necessarily think are true.
Want to try another? How do you, well, we've just done that one. Can you describe a situation wherein propaganda could benefit the public, or is propaganda by nature a suppression of the complete truth?
I think, is that a question for you, perhaps?
You want to ask me? I'm not big on propaganda.
Oh, I see. We each have... I'm sorry. By propaganda? I'm not sure... What do we mean by propaganda?
Well, I think something that is, you know, has a foregone conclusion in it. That,
You know, I think, you know, the propaganda of America is public relations. I think the propaganda of America is hype. Do you know what I mean? Because things are, the hype is one thing and the reality is another, and it's the kind of like commercial world sales version of propaganda, and I think we're really stuck with plenty of that. Here's one for you, Orville. Could you say a few words about who the people behind the scenes at Fresh Air are?
well, Terry, I'd
not.
be happy to.
Oh, I see. This is a question for me. I see. Okay.
So you can be the autodidact here.
So who? The staff that I work with. Well, they're great people. Some of the staff I've worked with, we've worked together for 10 years. Danny Miller, who I've worked with, we've worked together since 1978. I mean, our relationship has lasted a lot longer than I think most marriages in America last. When I first met Danny, I was one of those people who like smoked and stopped smoking every other week, you know. And so the first thing he said to me when this is when he was applying to be an intern for the show many years ago, the first thing he said was, "Do you have a cigarette? I'm trying to stop," you know. And I thought, this guy's got it made. But you know, he was like an amateur jazz pianist who was playing in a salsa band. I thought, this guy, I got to work with him. So.
This person would like to know, and in part you've answered this, what do you do to prepare for an interview?
Well, what I do is read everything I can in the limited time that I have about the person, by the person, see as much. You know, I'll run a little like video mini film festival at my home before an interview with anyone involved in film. I'll just do what I can to study up on the subject. I kind of have my own version of speed reading. So I couldn't hold forth on the subject, but I feel it's my job to frame the subject. I can't possibly be the expert on it. I wish I maintained the memory of everything that I learned for the next day. Everyone I know has memory problems now. Yeah.
Well, I think, hard disks only have so much space on them.
No, I know. I know. I know.
Would you enjoy or agree to do a television show?
I've done a little bit of television, and I enjoyed the experience very much. And I think, that every medium is as good as what you do with it. So I have no real stereotypes of what television is. It's a question of what it can be. So, I enjoy it. I'd be happy to try it again sometime. I love the invisibility of radio, and I've never seen radio as, like the minor league where I'm just really preparing to be in the show that really counts, which is television, which is, I think, what some people assume. I've never felt that way, and I think I'm really lucky to work in that invisible world. So, I'd be happy to stay. I'd be happy to try a little bit of television. But, I'll be honest about it. I've always had the kind of face. When I was young, people used to come up to me and say, "What's wrong, dear? You look lost." And the television audiences watching this might unfortunately have some evidence of what I'm talking about here. But I seem to have the kind of face that when I'm not kind of like, ha ha ha, laughing or something, when I'm just kind of listening, and that's what you do as an interviewer, you listen, I'm just kind of I'm not even in my body. Do you know what I mean? I'm just like a big ear. And so like my everything's just kind of slack. Do you know what I mean? I'm just an antenna. And no, I don't think that's like good television. And there's this sense that, like even if you're just listening on television, you have to be like smiling and look, just like, yeah, tell us more. Oh, it's thrilling. And I don't know how to do that. And I'm not sure I'll ever learn how to do that. And so I'm not sure I'd ever really make it on television for that reason, even if I were really striving to. I'm not sure it's a good thing to admit, but, but it's
well, Terry,
true.
in TV parlance, it could never be said that you have big hair.
That's right. Who does the hairdos? Who gives the people that? And those big swoops of hair for the men, I don't understand. It's like they're from another planet, I've never understood it.
Well, when you say that you want to give people a place where they can sound like themselves,
yeah.
I think, television doesn't have an awful lot of places where you can look like yourself.
No, and the first few times I did television, I mean, everybody said, don't wear black. I thought, oh, great, that's all I own is black. And I'm a hard-to-fit size. I'm really short. And shopping for me, it's such a nuisance. Nothing ever fits. And the things that fit tend to be black. So if I'm doing a TV show, instead of being home preparing, I'm at the shopping mall. I can't even shop at boutiques because there's nothing there that fits me. All those hip clothing stores. I'm too short for hip clothing stores. So it's just a pain. It's a pain having to worry about all of that.
Well, invisibility is certainly, I think of the editor of The New Yorker, formerly William Shawn, who never did interviews, rarely had a photo taken. I think there were only a few existing. Didn't go to cocktail parties, didn't hobnob, was not in the society columns. I mean, and he was, I think, one of the last of the invisible major figures in the media, yourself accepted. And here you are on television.
There was a time when I wouldn't allow my picture to be taken. It was a short time, but it was early in radio, and my feeling was the beautiful thing about imagining someone on radio is that they are not, you can't possibly, I was so afraid that people would see me and would have this stereotype of who I was and what I believed and what I would be capable of being fair with and what I'd be incapable of. So I thought the less people knew, the more I could be what I needed to be at the moment. And I don't mean be a phony, but that I'd be able to be funny at one moment and serious another and relate to this part of, kind of flexible in my... And I wanted to be invisible. I wanted to be whoever you needed me to be, I wanted to be that. And lo and behold, I think there's a lot of truth in that, because so often somebody has met me and I've been wrong. I don't know if you've experienced this from your byline, but sometimes people meet me in person And they think, well, they like the show, and they think, therefore, maybe I'm going to be larger than life. And I am literally smaller than life. You know, I'm very short. I'm not striking. Outside of being short, I'm not striking to look at in any way. You know what I mean? I'm just a very kind of unextraordinary looking person. And if somebody likes you a lot and you're on the radio, they make this assumption that you must be beautiful, or, you know, that you must be like tall and imposing. And if you're not that, people, they don't know how to react. And I've seen people almost trying to like hide their disappointment. And it's like, you know, what, and so you watch as they try to like get over it. You know? Did this ever happen to you, Orville, that somebody had the sense of you from like your byline, and it's like, nah.
Well, let me ask you this, Terry. Has the concept of an ideal reader changed over the years? Do focus groups rule, or how do you decide who your audience is?
I actually went to my first focus group a few months ago.
Is that like an encounter group?
It was bizarre. I mean, there was a two-way. We did not organize this, but it was a long story behind how it was organized. But you know, there's a two-way mirror, and they can't see you, but you can see them talking about you. And it was such a creepy feeling. I felt like a voyeur with a kind of hidden camera watching people talking about our show and talking about me. It was a very weird, and I have to say kind of unpleasant experience. And there, in all honesty, there are more focus groups being done now for NPR shows. And I have mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, I think that you really do learn a lot by hearing people who don't necessarily know what it, you know, that you're there listening, though they probably really know. You learn a lot hearing them talk about your show. On the other hand, it's what do you do with that information? Are you going to, therefore, just give people what they say they want, and if they don't like obscure poets, that you never have on a poet again? Or do you just use it to enhance your knowledge of how people use the show, but still continue to follow what you think is an appropriate editorial agenda? And I think, you know, democracy in the media is very strange. You know, people think that if the way to be a good editor is to give people what they want. But on the other hand, don't you think it's our job as editors to make editorial decisions that aren't necessarily going to reflect what's most popular, but reflect rather what we as editors think is important? Because thank you. No, because sometimes, gosh, isn't it always true that the best art isn't necessarily the most popular art? And it's, you know, in retrospect, people might realize it's the best, but somebody's got to be out there saying, this is really good, and I want you to know about it. And, you know, I don't care if it's popular now or not. I think it's great. And you have to have some trust in your own editorial opinion. You know, you have to have some trust that you're not just following your quirky taste, but that you're informed enough to think that this is a really legitimate judgment that you're making.
You know, I think one can stretch the analogy to politics, whereby, you know, you can look at the process that we are now enjoying as somewhat mutant in that politicians may seem to be very democratic in consulting ordinary people as to their preferences and their likes about one thing or another. But in fact, as they are doing this, they're also abdicating leadership. Because if in fact the leaders are following the people and the people are half asleep, you know, and one could say this true is about culture as well. If we're just seeing Titanic over and over again, you know, we will be making no sort of forward motion, and we will be in a relatively stale environment.
Yeah, yeah. But do you find now that editors want to just cover stories, you know, to just cover the big story of the day? And you know, you have been, I'm sure there's times when people don't want to know about China, people think, right? That, you know, China, we don't want to hear about that now. But Tiananmen Square, people would probably sell their mother to get you as their network expert, because you're the man, you're the guy who knows. Have you ever been like the network expert during one of those feeding frenzy moments when like every single network, whether it's CNN or C-SPAN or NBC or ABC, they're all like, what's happening in China right now? Have you ever been the expert for that? And what kind of deal do they make with you? What do they want from you? What do they offer you?
I mean, this was the situation during 1989 and the Tiananmen Square demonstrations. Well, I mean, suddenly it becomes a seller's market, whereas when at all other times it's a buyer's market. I mean, you can't get them to pay attention. And they tend to, what they tend to do is all bid for your services, even if they're not going to use it, because they don't want you to go to the other place. And if you merely utter the word ABC to NBC, they will just throw exorbitant amounts of money at you because they're trying to sort of make sure at least if they don't use you, someone else won't. So it is a rather eerie and strange experience. And of course, all of this completely ignores whether you have anything to say. It's another kind of a transaction that goes on.
Do you find that you can do justice to a story in a situation like that? Are you glad to have that as a forum when the big story is breaking?
I mean, it's always tempting, but I think you almost always come away from it feeling somehow incomplete. It isn't a satisfying experience. Have you been asked to be on television, to go on Nightline,
to be an expert?
Well, someone might ask you to come and review films for some show. Has anyone suggested that you might be a good candidate?
I've been asked to review in some context, but I don't feel it. My husband is actually a critic. My husband is a jazz critic, a music critic, and so I feel like I'm really exposed to excellent criticism. A lot of my friends are literary and film and music critics, and I know that's not my calling. I know what the good stuff is, so I don't I don't do that myself. But I don't see, that's another reason why I've never been a reporter. I don't feel like I'm good at holding forth on things.
You've done well tonight, Terry.
Oh, well, thanks, but I really much prefer asking the questions, and because I genuinely prefer asking the questions, I mean, tonight our goal is to interview each other, and I've been finding it actually like functioning with my left and right brain at the same time. It's actually been I don't know how you felt, Orville, I found it really difficult actually to be both the interviewer and the interviewee, because like both sides are working at the same time, and it's usually not that way. I'm usually just so focused on what the person is saying and where I want to take them next, that to be answering as well as asking has been very disorienting and difficult.
Well, I share that sentiment. I mean, there is this kind of a certain surreal quality to two people, you know, pretending they're just in their kitchen, having a conversation, whereas the interview form is a form. And, you know, one person is there to facilitate another person downloading a certain amount of information reviews. I mean, in this case, I mean, it's been a lot of fun to do it, but it is, neither person sort of has control. And you're not quite sure where it will go. And, you know, actually, sometimes when you speak, I forget to think of a question.
Right, exactly.
Which would be all right if we were at the kitchen table.
Right. Well, I would say there's people, you want something to sound like just a conversation, but you want it to be very different than that. Do you know what I mean? You want it to be just like so rich and so focused in a way that real conversations usually aren't, which is another reason. No, it's true. And it's another reason why I really like being in radio, because sometimes, as much as I feel like I've missed out on real life because I've been so busy working, often real life is boring and problematic, and I love the edited version of it, you know?
Terry, let me ask you one other question. Tomorrow there are 150 people coming to the journalism school to talk about the internet, the web, and journalism. You know, where is this taking us, and how does it relate to doing this craft well? how do you see the future in terms of, I mean, in a certain sense, you live in a very primitive world of radio. I mean, when you look at it on the electromagnetic spectrum, I mean, we had telephone, radio, television, satellites, the internet.
So where do I see the internet or radio?
Yeah, I mean, how does that fit into your career plans?
I mean, I don't know. It's funny. I mean, our show is on the internet. You need some kind of gizmo to download it, but we're on the internet, and I don't even know how to work the gizmo, and that's kind of where I'm at. You know, it's like I'm both there and can't access it at the same time. So I'm utterly confused, and I have no idea how any of this is going to affect radio. I have no idea where internet journalism is going to be heading, and I figure it's going to be as good as the journalists who are doing it. And I think it's something that's in its formative stages now, and I'm really curious to see what happens. Do you use the internet much for research or publication?
You know, I suffer from, like you, so much information overload that I'm trying to sort of bail it out of my life rather than to find ways to get more of it. And so I'm not as highly evolved in this respect as some people. And yet I recognize it as inevitably going to be part of our futures, and certainly part of the futures of people who are younger.
Yeah. This is a question that I think was meant for me, but I'd like to hear what you think about this, Orville. Talk about the art and craft of interviewing. Do you like to start with easy or tough questions? Somebody once walked out on me because I started with the tough questions. I thought, you know, I'm not going to do this charade. You know, this is what I want to ask you, so I'll just start asking it. And then the publicist called up afterwards and said to my producer, doesn't she know anything about interviewing? You're supposed to start easy and, you know, kind of, you know, warm them up and then ask the tough questions. I thought, you know, thanks. But do you have, like, if you're interviewing even, you know, someone in a government position or whatever, do you do that whole thing of starting easy and then asking the hard questions?
I mean, I think it depends on what the level of sort of potential antagonism is, or resistance. But I mean, I think an interview is very much almost a seduction sometimes. Mm-hmm. You have to not deceive people, but win them over. And they do feel comfortable if, you know, you go through certain formalities. It's like going out to dinner, you know, with a date. And then you've got to go through the various stages. But if you just sort of jump on someone, as you evidently, was that Jan Wenner that you?
Yeah, right, that happened to be Jan Wenner, yeah.
Do you find that you carefully sculpt your interviews in this respect?
Well, him I didn't, but, but on the other hand, the questions didn't seem hostile to me that he took in a hostile way. But I mean, what I try to kind of sculpt in a way is just a kind of narrative context to the interview so that the story will have some kind of flow. And then, yeah, I'm usually not going to start with the most personal or the most challenging question, you know, and kind of gradually lead up to that. That is usually, it is almost always true. That I'll start with things that are really kind of easier to answer and then try to establish some kind of rapport and trust and slowly get to the more problematic questions.
It is a kind of relationship. Well, Terry, I think we have run out of time. I want to thank you for appearing tonight and coming to Berkeley. It's really wonderful to have you, and I hope we'll get you back again soon sometime.
And thank you for inviting me out to the School of Journalism, and thank you for being here tonight and you know, coming to hear us. And it's fun, you know, the house lights have been on, so I've been able to kind of see your faces, and I know you might have been curious to see mine, but believe me, I'm curious to see yours. So thank you very, very much for coming.